All right, guys. So welcome to the weekly Dirty Marketing. What are we calling these things? Dirty Marketing webinar from Thanks.io, sponsored by Thanks.io. Today, what I was hoping to do, you probably got the email if you're on, was introduce my friend Michael Sharkey here in St. Pete. Michael is well, you're first and foremost, you're a radio guy, right? You've been in radio.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my background, 25 years of doing radio. So, and then just shifted about 6 years ago to really hyper focus on podcasting because I saw the growth coming.
Yeah. So Michael does a lot with podcasting. He helped me launch my Dirty Marketing podcast, which I've been a bad boy. I haven't done many episodes lately, but we can talk about that. I find it easier to hop on one of these webinars personally. Right. It's just force of habit. But so what I thought we'd do is kind of walk through some of the questions that I know you generally go to when you talk to somebody new. And
Sure.
I'll kind of let you go. You can do a quick intro, and then maybe we'll start to talk about the why behind podcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Michael Sharkey. As Ryan said, we've worked together. We've known each other for a long time. But my background, 25 years in radio, but really have focused the last 6-7 years on helping professionals, so businesses across a variety of industries, create compelling podcasts. And when I say compelling, what I mean by that is it's a podcast that you'd actually kind of want to listen to. And I think that's the big difference is a lot of podcasts are not so good. So taking audio storytelling fundamentals from years and years in radio, I basically empower people and coach people, because that was my role in radio, is to coach radio personalities, to creating these podcast coaching, guiding, teaching different fundamentals. But again, I've worked with accountants. One of my biggest clients is a software engineering firm in New York City. But I also work with radio people, and I've worked with a celebrity chef. And I feel like, you can kind of take these rules and plug them into a podcast, and it helps tell a story in a way that video doesn't, in a way that YouTube won't, in a way that blogs don't. Not that those are bad things. It's just that podcasts have a very unique power about them.
Can you talk about the different, because I was surprised to hear the different demographic kind of breakdown of who you're going to reach with a podcast versus some of the other channels that are available?
Well, what's interesting is the world's changing all the time. Podcast used to be just, it started off with just tech people. It was just software engineers. But really it was like around the time 2014, 2015, 2016, it was the NPR crowd. It was like all the 50-year-old men and things like that. And what we've seen over the last few years is just an explosion. Now it's really big 25, 34. So it's a really big, younger type thing as far as podcast. And, podcasts have a sort of a different definition. Some people say, hey, I watch podcasts on YouTube or things like that. When I refer to podcast, it's more of the traditional published podcasts in an Apple podcast or in a Spotify and things like that. And I think because of Spotify coming into the game so strong over the last year, you just see, there's kids podcasts now, there's How to Have Sex When You're a Senior podcast, and everything in between.
Yeah, I've noticed that on Spotify too, and they do a good job of suggesting things, so I can see how that bring people in who might not listen before. I'm curious, everybody who's listening, do you listen to podcasts? And if so, if you want to drop in the chat who you listen to.
I'd love to see that.
Yeah, some of the big ones are the Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, right?
Yeah, Joe Rogan, about 2 months ago, there was an open-ended survey of, basically what name do you think of when you think of podcasting? And Joe Rogan came out number one. So he's the most identifiable name as it relates to podcasts in general. Yeah.
So if everybody on this call probably has some kind of business, or they're self-employed and they have the need to market. That's why they're on this Dirty Marketing podcast. So Who would you say is a good candidate? What kind of businesses does this make sense for? Because it's a little bit of work. It's like a time investment at least, right?
Yeah, that's kind of one of the interesting things about it is I've seen podcasts work for a lot of different industries, even visual industries. Like I said, I worked with a celebrity chef where a lot of that is, the visual of food and things like that. But, it's storytelling. And if you can think of your business and then frame it from the perspective of the story you can tell, then really it becomes a universal platform. I've seen podcasts sort of in the professional space. I saw a company in radio that I worked with did a 6-part podcast of a lawn care company in Connecticut. And they told a really fascinating story, and it was kind of a big reveal at the end where they showed pictures of people's lawns on their podcast page. But I think if you bring into it the host's perspective, so I'll use you, Ryan. You're a digital marketing expert. You know everything there is to know about marketing. But if you just did a marketing podcast, Ryan, it would have got lost. But because your personality is such, you've got this fun, high energy personality, and you've got these wacky tips. So doing a dirty marketing podcast is a home run for you. And you should do more episodes too. As your coach, you need to do more episodes.
I know. So are you saying that if you can tell a story about your business, what does that mean? And I think maybe I'll bring up real estate as an example, because I know some of the people listening were following. How does a solo kind of entrepreneur, realtor do podcasting in a way that actually gives ROI?
That's a great question. So in the real estate space, so storytelling, let's say I'm a realtor and I'm in St. Petersburg, Florida. I know the neighborhoods. I know somebody can say, oh yeah, this is this neighborhood or this is that neighborhood. And I have that understanding, but maybe this realtor can start by telling the story of what that community means to them. He or she can start off by saying, maybe they were born and raised in that area, or they have a memory of going to St. Pete High. So it establishes that credibility of their familiarity with that area. So one of the suggestions I had for another realtor that I was going to work with was, do something simple, a neighborhood of the week. Maybe, I think it's kind of an easy go-to with sort of the hot deals or, what's happening in the market or et cetera. And I think that's good. But when you start to tap into the timelessness of audio content, so I can tell a story in a podcast, and if I do it right, it's relevant today and it's relevant 6 years from now. And I think with real estate, you can have a function of a podcast that's very timely. Here's what's happening in the market today. But when you start to get into the timelessness of it, and you're telling those stories, maybe you were raised there, here's a beautiful house, and then you start to incorporate maybe pictures and show notes, then you start to tell a full, robust story. But it all comes back to the audio storytelling that anyone can do. And if you know how to do it and capture people's attention, and you don't have to know how to write a movie to be able to tell a good story. It's just understanding where to begin, what happens in the middle, and ultimately at the end.
And what a lot of podcasters do, and this could work for agents too, is they let people tell their stories. So in a local market, I could just grab other business owners I know, people who live in the area, and be like, hey, how do you like living in St. Pete? And just
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's the other, you bring up a great point, because you don't have to tell every story. You can let others tell the story. So if you're a realtor in a market, get out there with really easy equipment to use. And if we talk about tech at some point, I want to bust all those myths. But ultimately, you can, go to a local restaurant or a local store or whatever that looks like in your community, interview that person, and then their stories shine because you were the avenue, you were the podcast that helped them come to light.
And by interviewing other people, this is the common hack, is that you then hack into their audience and they'll share the interview.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So why is now, so I just put some bullets here, and I'm thinking, I've been talking a lot about this in other places about how we're all sitting at home right now. It's March, just in case, it's early April 2020. So if somebody's listening to this later,
we're in the middle. We're in the middle of madness.
Yeah, we're in the middle of madness. And why is now a good time to get started? It just seems like there's some opportunity to launch this sort of thing.
There's two reasons why it's really important to look at right now as a great time. One, you just said it. People have more time, whatever it looks like for you. Even if, you're just as busy with your job today as you were a month ago, things like your commute time just got eliminated. You realize now, I mean, we work from home and have been for years, but you realize now, if you're not going into the office, how much time you waste every day. So the first thing is you have a lot of time right now to devote to a project like starting a podcast. But if you start one right now, if you get into it right now, and again, podcasts are, they're an investment in time, but it's not like it's not gonna, be this huge thing. There's ways to make it easy. But the reality is if you start right now, when the cycle of the world starts kicking back in and people are in it, you're already going to be ahead of the game. You're already going to have content out there ready to go, published and live, so that you have this thing to point to when the world starts moving again.
Yeah, and the other thing I noticed from my own personal experience, those first episodes I did, I liked them, but I almost am thinking about them now as they were good practice, and now I have a much better idea of where I want to go with that podcast.
Right.
So it's kind of like just get that learning curve out of the way.
Yeah, and the other thing that I've noticed, and you probably have seen this too, I have a lot more engagement right now. Like so my email list is way higher engagement. So people are home. So you could actually start a podcast right now, and maybe the beginning of your podcast, even though you're going to do a business podcast or a real estate podcast or whatever, you could start right now by documenting what's happening in your life. Have your friends listen, give you feedback, things like that. I mean, I could not think of a better time to start a podcast than right now.
So coming up with an idea or a theme, I know you think that's important. Like you want to have some kind of content framework.
Yeah.
What is that each episode? How's it going to look? What's going to be about? How do you come up with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think every podcast is different. And every person who is going to host a podcast is going to approach it differently. So it's really, that's part of why I coach and I work a lot of one-on-one, is to kind of go, okay, what's your idea? But what is the perspective that you're bringing into it? I'll go back to you, Ryan. You could have done a marketing podcast and then it would have been great. But the problem would have been, how would it have cut through amongst all the other marketing podcasts? So I think what's important is to take your idea, don't make it too broad, make sure that you've niched it down and you sort of layer it down to where it's an idea that touches a very specific audience. And then you factor in what perspective you have. So if you're a real estate agent, back to that example, maybe you grew up in the area, maybe, you're raising a family in the area. So you immediately make a relatable statement or relatable sense to other families in your community. So when you start to think about what emotions come into play, then it's not just, hey, I've got an idea and I want to do a podcast about, cooking. It's, hey, my background is Italian. My wife is from Italy. I love the passion of food. I want to do a podcast about pasta. As strange as that would sound, you'd probably have a lot of listeners if you did a pasta podcast.
Nice. So think about so it doesn't just need to be business. It could be what you're into, and then you can draw your business in. Can you talk a little bit about that, about how using the sort of channel and the content as a way to then promote whatever you're doing?
Yeah. I mean, the thing with a podcast is when you think about how you engage, how everyone engages with content. I read a blog, I watch a YouTube video, I watch a Facebook Live, I watch a webinar, I listen to a podcast. The experience of listening to a podcast is completely different because the visual is gone. Your eyes aren't part of it. So it becomes a very intimate experience. So when you start to bring people into whatever it is you're doing with a podcast, if you do it right and you're able to tell a story with, and again, I don't want to make it sound too complicated because it can be done very effectively. But as you begin the story of who you are, then maybe that branches into who you are as a business leader. I work with another woman, fantastic woman. She has a very big marketing agency, but she doesn't want to do a marketing podcast. Her passion is building culture and building a good team and being a values-based organization. So she's going to direct people to her marketing, but her goal was, I want to create a podcast that tells a story about building a culture, a values-based organization, so that I attract clients I want to work with.
Got it. Yeah, I got it. So, all right. So nitty gritty. Does anybody listening have any questions, by the way? Feel free to chime in, guys. If you do have a podcast and you're listening, just feel free to chat. It just occurred to me, Michael, too, this idea of repurposing content. I could probably take this and make it a podcast episode, right?
Yeah, I was actually going to say that earlier. You are busy. I know you. I know how busy you get and how busy you are. You could make your life easy, and I don't want to say there's rules to podcasting because truthfully, there are no rules. You can follow fundamentals that will help you grow your audience and help you tell a great story. But honestly, we're putting together good content for dirty marketing. Why not start posting? You do webinars all the time. Why not just replay the webinar as a podcast episode?
Yeah, I just thought about telling people to chat in. I was like, well, what if I use this? They won't be able to chat in on it. All right. So let's get into some of the tactical, like nitty gritty stuff here. I have a bullet point for the equipment. And you helped me a lot here, and it cost me, I think I invested about $120, $130.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about what you told me to get?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, my website is yourpodcastcoach.com, and I have a couple of different resources on there that are free that will help you build a studio. One of them is my 7-day podcast workshop, which is on the screen right now. If you go into that, there's a couple of different links that you can sign up for that. But bottom line is you don't need to spend a lot of money on equipment. Now, I always encourage you to create a sound within your podcast that sounds professional. And here's why. If you're listening to Joe Rogan, or if you're listening to an NPR podcast or whatever, and then, or if someone else, I should say, is listening, and then they come to your podcast and you've got a cheap microphone, or you tried to record it with your iPhone or whatever, that immediate drop in quality is going to turn somebody off. They're gone. Before you even had a chance to tell your story, they're gone. But the trick is you don't need to spend a lot of money on equipment to sound as good as Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss. The microphone, which I think you have, is a $35 Shure microphone that I recommend. Use a USB interface, which is that little red box that you have, Ryan. USB interface is just a thing you plug your microphone into that plugs into the USB jack of your computer. I don't recommend USB microphones. They're oftentimes too hollow sounding. Like if I'm not going to fight you over it. If you've got a good USB microphone, use it. But a lot of people like to use the the Yetis or the Snowball mics, and sometimes those mics just sound a little too thin. And again, you want to sound as good as Joe Rogan. I'm telling you, you can do that for $100, $200. It makes all the difference in the world. But something I mentioned a minute ago is that the tech is what everybody gets hung up on. Oh my God, it's so hard. I got to build a studio. It's going to be expensive. It's going to be all these things. The tech is easy. You buy a couple of pieces of equipment, you plug it in, you buy this, what you see on the screen right there, the Scarlett, and then the building of your story is where you want to put the effort and the work, the content, what your episodes are going to sound like, all that. It'll take you 5 minutes to go to my website, click into those links. If you actually go to yourpodcastcoach.com/studio checklist, if you type in studio checklist, I've put this on here as here's all the microphones that I do, the USB interface, a couple other like mic stands, things like that. It's not expensive. I always tell put this out there, buy the equipment. All those links are there if you wanted to use my site. Buy the equipment, be done with it, and move on. We don't need to have a 3-hour webinar on what microphones to buy, but I say that because a lot of people that I talk to are like, oh, well, what kind of microphone and how's the dynamic range and all this stuff. I don't know. I'm not a studio engineer. I just know I need to sound as good as Joe Rogan. And by purchasing a $35 microphone and, recording with a blanket on the wall, I can achieve that result.
My son Sam made fun of me so much until I got this setup you got me, because I didn't even realize my webinars, all the videos I record for probably a decade sounded like crap. I didn't even know, and until I got this. I really think I spent like 150 total, and now everything is just so much crisper. It's like the best investment.
Yeah. And the cool thing is you now have a microphone and a setup that you can use for webinars, for Zoom calls, for, I always joke
Screencasts.
Anything. And it's, and you just now upped the audio quality, for everything that you now do that requires, you're not wearing, a headset anymore. You're not talking into the microphone on your computer and things like that.
Yeah. So how do I get over sound? This is what a lot of people worry about, sounding stupid in quotation marks, but people aren't used to doing this sort of thing. What are some tips there? What do you say to that?
So part of what I always recommend with everyone I've ever worked with, and this is why I call my business Your Podcast Coach, because I have a coaching background, and you've got to have patience whenever you first start to record. People, a lot of people, whether it's doing a podcast or in your case, Ryan, doing webinars, I should say most people really have a challenge listening to the sound of their own voice.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fingernails on chalkboard type thing. And that's not just, that's not just business professionals. That is rampant throughout my entire radio career.
Until you start to love it, then it's a problem.
Yeah. Well, when you start to love your sound of your own voice, then you've got other issues that are coming into play. But, so one of the first hurdles is getting over that. And it's really just a matter of, once you get your studio set up, just start recording. Record anything. You can write a script and record it. You can talk about your day. The idea is that you want to get comfortable with literally headphones on, talking into a microphone, and then hearing what it sounds like. First few times, of course, you might sound a little cringeworthy, and I have seen, literally CEOs of multi-million-dollar corporations who came to me and were like, hey, I'm going to do a great podcast. This is going to be awesome. This is going to be awesome. They get to this moment where it's like, I'm going to record myself. And I've had two that I can think of right now who literally said, look, I'm going to pay you your fee, but I can't do this.
Have you offered those people? I'm going to turn it around on you. Have you offered to just co-host with those people?
The problem with that is, I'm of the belief that if you're going to create a podcast and you want to create that professional, compelling podcast that people want to listen to, it kind of needs to come from you.
Right.
And I experimented that a little bit with you, Ryan, on doing some intros or possibly some Q&As with you, but you sound the way you need to sound on your own.
Right.
So I've talked to people about doing co-host. I'm not opposed to it, but it ends up being a lot of work for me. So I'll be honest, if you want to do it, that's fine, but it's going to be expensive. Yeah. And ultimately I want to encourage people to try to, and I have talked to people about hosting their first season. So it's a bunch of Q&A with them, and then they host. It kind of gets them, comfortable with being in the studio. But ultimately, I steer away from that. But I'm up for that discussion.
I was just wondering if it's something people could do in general. Is it a good idea to get somebody else who's on with you so that it feels a little more organic, like a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if it's your podcast and it's like, hey, will you host it? Ultimately, it's going to need to be about, me interviewing you. Now, I have worked with a couple of organizations where they want to tell the story of the CEO of the company, but the CEO is too busy. So the marketing person ultimately does it. And then that marketing person just becomes the storyteller.
Got it. Cool. So get the first episode recorded. I kind of skipped here on the bullets. You want to talk about the software you use? I was surprised at how free and easy it is to. Oh
yeah. I mean, so software, Audacity is a recording software that is free. You can use it again. I think you got that up on your site right now. I use part of the Adobe suite. I use their program called Audition, which again, if you have the Adobe Cloud, so you have Photoshop or any of those, Adobe Audition is what I use. Generally, the interface of all these programs is about the same. And when you're doing a podcast, for the most part, you're probably not going to be trying to do an NPR style, big storytelling, a lot of different audio coming from a lot of different places. Those podcasts take anywhere from 40 to 60 hours to create for a 30-minute episode. So really, if you're just interviewing people, if you're just telling your story and you're adding in some music, Audacity is going to be all you'd ever need. I use Audition because I have the Adobe suite and I use that when I was in radio, and it's free. Audacity is free. And then to publish your podcast, everybody's like, oh my God, how does my podcast show up on iTunes, or how does it show up on Spotify? There's a couple of different services. I use Libsyn, Libsym. There you go. I use Libsyn. I spend $10, $12 a month on it. And it's a podcast hosting platform. That's all it is. And it makes sure that when somebody goes into my podcast and they hit play, it's there. And it hosts and gives statistics and allows me to publish it. And once you set it up, it takes about 15 minutes to set all of it up. Whenever I hit publish, within about 2 minutes, it shows up on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Stitcher and things like that.
Yeah, to me, that was mind blowing. I didn't realize it was that easy that once you set it up once with iTunes, for example, and Spotify, iTunes took a few weeks, right? Or a few days.
Yeah, they say iTunes, you want to give it at least 2 weeks. And this is a big thing to note, that if you are working on a podcast right now and you're thinking, hey, I'm gonna launch on, May 1st, you want to make sure you're publishing to iTunes at least 2 weeks before that date, so middle of April, because they say it takes a couple of weeks to not just get into the system, but also to index and do all those things. So, and just like anything, if you've ever worked with mobile apps or anything, iTunes, Apple lives in its own world. Spotify was pretty instantaneous. iHeartRadio, which is the other big podcast app right now, they won't let you publish until you're 2 months in. But most of iHeartRadio is radio shows who are podcasting.
Got it. Cool. So Libsyn, equipment, Audacity or Adobe, plug it into Libsyn and you're good to go. It's that easy.
Yeah. And like I said, I work, I will, for my clients who I've worked with, we'll spend a little bit of time on, the Libsyn stuff. I don't feel like it's a good use of my time because I want to talk about content and content creation and things like that, but it's going to take you, again, 15 minutes. I mean, it like from the time you get everything plugged in and you sign up for Libsyn and you connect it to iTunes, you're talking about maybe a half hour's worth of time, and then you never have to do it again.
Yeah, the harder part is what you're doing is helping craft the idea
right.
and the framework. You've helped me more. I don't think I would have gotten it launched, and I have 7 episodes in, but you've helped me more just with the little things I wouldn't even think to ask, right. until they pop up.
Right.
Right. So there is, I will say to everybody listening, this is a little more nuanced than we're making it sound, but I think the bullet point, what Michael just went through, is a good kind of macro outline. And if you follow these steps, you can get a podcast live.
Yeah. And I what I would say to that, back to the getting over sounding stupid, those are the hurdles that require some massaging, that require thought, that require, and I don't I've never been a big fan of the word stupid. It's just that's what everybody says to me. I don't want to sound stupid. I don't want to sound amateur. I mean, that's the kind of work that can be done. As far as the tech stuff, which people think is so challenging, it's not. And like I said, getting everything home, plugging it in, setting up Libsyn is a pretty simple thing that, don't think. The confusion I see is everybody thinks that the easy stuff is really hard and vice versa. The easy stuff is the technical. The hard stuff is the story and getting all that right.
So let's jump now into the how to promote your podcast. So I guess there's 2 phases of that: how to get people to listen, but also how to make it so that the content itself sells whatever you're selling. Advertising. How do you structure an episode so that it directs the attention to where you want it to be?
So there's a couple of things there. I mean, as far as like the promotion of your podcast, it really depends on what avenues that work for you in the past. So social media, your mailing list, things like that, check all of those boxes. If you've got a mailing list, whether it's 100 people or 10,000 people, when you put out a new episode, blast them with a, new episode alert is the verbiage that I always use. Put it on your social media pages, things like that. That sort of is the foundation of promoting it. Create the launch of your podcast, turn that into an event. Like I said, if you've got a date in the future, you're going to launch May 1st, start teasing to when that comes out. And I always recommend, not to get off topic, that the day that you launch with at least 5 episodes that are live, so people have more than just one thing to listen to. So promoting it around the launch, I would build that in the same cadence that you would a webinar, a blog, things like that. Now, the actual growth strategy, that's where when you have an opportunity to be a guest on someone else's podcast and then reciprocate that, absolute fastest way to grow a podcast.
All right, be a guest and have guests.
Be a guest and have guests, because it's going to be, let's say you're in the marketing space. So to use your podcast, if you're out and you're interviewing, other people in the marketing space, and then they reciprocate by putting you on their podcast, you both win. You probably, if you listen to enough podcasts, especially in the business space, you hear this a lot. It's almost like they ran out of people, so they just keep interviewing each other over and over and over again. It's like, oh, this person's got a webinar, this person's got an ebook, this person, and it ends up becoming a little, it's like a, very cannibalistic almost. But, if you are going into it, finding those unique people to talk to, whatever your subject matter is, interview them. Then they're excited. They're like, oh my God, I'm going to be on this podcast. And then they blast to all their socials.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing to do.
I'm gonna start everybody on right now. I want you to be a guest on the Dirty Marketing Podcast so that you can then tell all your people to listen.
Yes.
You just gave me an idea. But all the realtors listening, anybody else, you could just get your existing customers and the people to just come on and talk to you. It's not doesn't need to be overthought, right? Yep.
Yeah, and that's a good, it's put the thinking in the right place, but sometimes don't overthink it. Don't make it harder than it needs to be. And just again, as a coach, see this a lot. People will use things that aren't that challenging, or they'll overthink it, because really what they're doing, it's a mental block over things like, don't like the sound of my own voice. And, again, that's kind of the case with a lot of different things in this space, be it webinars, Facebook Lives, podcasts, that sort of thing.
Cool. I'll just share a few things that I tried in mine, because I treated this as very experimental the first few months. I tried some pay-per-click. The problem I had with pay-per-click is I couldn't track really the results, but I did see a spike in listeners. I haven't tried Thanks.io postcards and letters, but I definitely need to do that. I actually think a letter that invites the right target to come and listen could work. Hey, there's a marketing podcast here, come listen. Michael, did I tell you I tried Spotify ads?
Oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So if you do launch a podcast, that is a viable channel. I got clicks for $1.70 a piece to the podcast page. So I don't know if that's good or bad, but it was people already who are podcast listeners. So once you're on there, you get like this page. That's what I'm trying to show people.
Yeah, and that makes actually a lot of sense, because people are consuming audio. Right. And then they are, and then you're right there. So, I think that makes sense.
And you can target locally, by the way. So you can target in a local market, or you can target by keyword or by the music that they're listening to.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah. And just like a lot of things, a good rule of thumb is to experiment, but also a good rule of thumb. And I say this to all the professionals I work with, is that when you have a podcast that's out there, you now have a very cool new business card. So when you're at a party and somebody's like, oh my God, what do you do? I'm in marketing or business or a chef or whatever, the next thing should be, you should check out my podcast. And I think we're in a space right now with podcasting where not everybody, there's 3 billion blogs out there, but there's not even 1 million podcasts out there. So again, back to the opportunity. Now's a great time to get in for a lot of reasons. And one of them is, podcasting is just starting to come into this like real sweet spot where, pretty soon you might be at a party in a couple of years and it's like, oh, I got a podcast. Oh, so do I. Where now, as you say that at a party and people are like, oh shit, what do you do?
Yeah. Cool. So, and then how to generate business from the podcast. I kind of structured mine as an affiliate marketing play, as a way to promote Thanks in general. So there's a couple of, I'll let you talk about, but the things I think about are like personal brand building, right?
Yeah. So whenever I work with someone, one of the first questions is, hey, what are your goals? What are you trying to get out of this? And invariably from a business perspective, that's where this comes in. And there's a couple of different things. So I'll give you an example. The software company that I work with in New York City, they're a software consultancy. What they wanted more than anything else was to be, seen as a leader in the software engineering industry, so that they could recruit software engineers. It was really fascinating. They weren't trying to get clients. They weren't trying to, and this is a company, I know Casper was one of their clients. I think, one of the big food, take home meal, cook at home type thing. It's a big software industry or consulting in the software industry. And what they needed really good developers. So they created content that would speak directly to the software engineer, so that the software engineer was like, damn, I really want to go work for this company. So in thinking about generating business, you need to first ask, what are you trying to generate? Is it leads? Is it clients? Is it are you using it as a hiring platform? And, you can mix that up a little bit. What I do with the Your Podcast Coach podcast, it's tips for people that are starting a podcast. So it's a bit meta, but what I like with that is that for me, I can't sit here and say, hey, I'm going to help you do a podcast if I don't have a podcast myself. But if you're able to go in and, for me, create leads, people listen, they sign up for the 7-day podcast workshop or they go to my website, then I can start a conversation about their podcast and what goals they have. For sales, that's kind of the no-brainer. The sales thing is I have a product to sell. And what I'm doing is I'm using my podcast to tell a story about the product so that people have an affinity to that thing they're about to go buy.
Yeah, got it. And then you can do, one of the things that I found really interesting is doing my own ads within my content. So I like to drop like affiliate links in the actual flow. I'll go buy a .info domain, for something and casually mention, oh yeah, I use this for that, and then you can go get your account over here and redirect to my affiliate link. So
yeah,
it's really neat when you have people engaged, just like the webinar people are sitting on now, or if you're listening in podcast form, like you have such attention and people are just sitting there. And I know that as I popped up Michael's screen, Your Podcast Coach, some of the people listening went there. As we showed the mic, people went over there. And
right.
It's just, you have attention and you can divert it. That's the essence of marketing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And like you said a minute ago, I do the same thing. So about 3/4 of the way through every episode, stop down, transition music. And then I basically voice a 60-second commercial for a service that I provide, or usually I'm doing a commercial for like my 7-day podcast workshop because I want people to go sign up. It's a great tool. It's a free resource. So for me, it's list building. For me, I'm trying to create a community of people that are interested in starting a podcast. Look, you can start a podcast in your basement talking about bourbon or whiskey or whatever, and that's great. Do that. But it's when you want to answer the questions that you're talking about, Ryan, you want to grow business, you want leads, you want to hire people, whatever, then that's the community that I want to build, is people that are saying, hey, look, I want to do this, but I want to do it right. And I want it to sound professional.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. I think we covered a lot of it. Does anybody listening have questions? Anything? You got Michael here. We also have the Facebook group. You can always chime in there and say, hey, I have a podcast question. And Michael, you're in there, right?
Yeah, I see. Actually, I see there's a few questions in the Q&A.
Oh, I missed those. Here. Let's
Okay.
see. Thank you. I was looking at the chat. All right. So Nick's asking, I did buy some equipment that is collecting dust. How often are you suggesting doing podcasts?
Yeah, it looks like Nick also asked how long should they be. So my big thing on doing on how often should you release episodes, you really have to kind of think about what you're capable of doing. So a big hack is, if you can do every week, do every week. But if you can't, do a season. Do 8 to 10 episodes, bundle them together. If you can do it over, maybe a specific subject matter for the first season or the second season or what have you, do that. And then 2 months later, release your second season. So it works within the framework that works for you. I release my podcast weekly, and it was every other week until coronavirus. And now I've got more time, so I do it weekly. And as far as how long podcast episodes should be, there's no perfect answer, but the answer I always give is not 1 second longer than it needs to be. And what I mean by that is, don't take 50 minutes to tell a 5-minute story. And that's the problem a lot of people run into, is that they talk too long or they feel like they need to fill time, and you really don't. I have 6-minute episodes. I have 25-minute episodes. Think about if I had to put a number on it, 24 minutes is like it's the average commute time in America. So that's a nice number to throw out there. Yeah. But some people do half hour. Some people do 10 minutes. Some people, Joe Rogan does 2.5-hour podcasts.
Tim Ferriss is like, you got to commit.
Yeah. And one of my favorite podcasts of all time is Hardcore History. Dan Carlin will do a 6-hour podcast, but it's, if you're into cool history, then that's exactly how long it's supposed to be.
Yep. Yep. So as long as you want it to be, how often as often as you want it to be. But I do think I think Nick's in real estate. I think for people, I think a good way to kind of install this into your business is to say, hey, I'm going to interview one business owner in my market once a week or even once a month, and set
Yeah.
it as an appointment with yourself. I also know some guys, Michael, they'll schedule back-to-back interviews in like a whole day, right? And do
Oh
like
yeah,
a month
yeah.
worth.
That
But
again. That's the hack right there. Find a day, and it's do it on a Tuesday or whatever that day is, and I mean, just go. Like think of that day. If they can, if somebody cannot, be on the schedule for that day, then get them the next time. But
right.
really, it's about because the other thing is when you interview somebody, you want to be in that frame of mind. You don't want to be like, hey, I'm going to like focus on this analytical project, and then I'm going to come over here and creatively interview somebody, and then I'm going to go back over here. No, if you interview 5 people in a row, then you're in that mindset, and your interviews are going to sound so much better. But then ultimately, you've just knocked out 5 interviews, and you've just created a ton of great content.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do next, Michael. I'm going to pick a day and just invite like 100 people to come be a guest and see who signs up. And you just do it in half-hour blocks, right?
Yeah. How about, yeah. And you don't need to, again, Joe Rogan is Joe Rogan. Let Joe Rogan be the best Joe Rogan can be. You don't need to interview somebody for 2.5 hours.
No.
A 20-minute interview, and even edited down to like 15 minutes is perfect. I just heard, if you ever listen to NPR, How I Built This, Guy Raz interviewed the guy that invented Slack, or the guy that released Slack. It was a 16-minute interview. He covered like 2 topics. It was awesome.
Yeah, and that's what I think what I'll do, and I think is a good tip, is just have like, if you're going to do interviews, just have 1 or 2 questions ready, and just go from there.
Yeah.
Dean Jackson does it great. Dean Jackson's a marketer. He's got More Cheese, Less Whiskers, and that's kind of how he does it. He just gets people on, and he has a whole thing on his website. It's like, sign up to be a guest on my podcast. I think that's how he gets people. Yeah, and then James asked, what do you do if you say the wrong thing, something that turns the crowd against you? I think I know the answer, but I'll let you take it. It's a beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that it's, a podcast. So first of all, if you were to say the wrong thing when recording, you edit it out.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
So no one ever hears. It's not live, so that's the beauty of a podcast, is it's not live. So you don't have to make it live. You don't have to do anything. I mean, again, we're doing a live webinar and you can record it and things like that, but you could even edit this at the end if something was wrong, something that turns the crowd against you. So let's say you do something, you say something and you publish it, and now it's out there and it gets this negative reaction. Go into Libsyn and get rid of it.
You can overwrite it.
You can overwrite it. If you say something, then, just go back in, edit something out, and I mean, it literally, I think when you and I talked about this a couple of months ago, I mean, it's like, it'll take you like 2 minutes.
Yeah, I did the episode with Richard Barker, who's in the Dirty Marketing Mastermind, and I forgot to cut off the end, and I was talking like, so embarrassing. Like, you keep talking to somebody. I was like, oh crap, I don't want everybody to hear what I'm saying.
Right.
I was just being a nutball,
Right.
And then you can go back, and it was very easy to do. So nothing to worry about. It is interesting. I've done very little promotion. I'm still getting some organic action. I've been very bad, but it's interesting how these function is they get natural traffic.
Yeah, they do. And that's, that's the other thing that I say to professionals is, you're beginning something right now that, and from a marketing perspective, it's not like, again, podcasts are like something that you must do as opposed to blogs or videos or whatever. They just all have their unique space. But the thing about a podcast is you can create content today that will sound as good today as it will 6 years from now. So you have to kind of think of a podcast as a long tail approach that again, the sooner you start creating, the sooner I did my first podcast, over 100 episodes. The Your Podcast Coach podcast, I think I've done 25 released episodes and then some bonus episodes. But it's being consistent when you release. It's putting it out there. Don't go, oh my God, I did 1 episode and I got like 3 downloads or whatever. No, it's a part of a long story. And look at it this way. When you have 50 episodes and somebody discovers you, because they will, now they've got 50 different things to listen to. and then they tell a friend, and then they tell a friend. So it can be a real big organic play for you.
Yeah, we didn't talk much about the App Store and iTunes and the amount of traffic, the volume that you can get from iTunes and Spotify just for free.
Yeah.
Over time, but it's out there. I think we're going pretty good. We're going pretty long. I don't want to keep everybody too long today. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Michael, or anybody else have any questions?
Well, the only thing I would add is please listen to my podcast. So you can search Your Podcast Coach on iTunes, on Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. But go to yourpodcastcoach.com. If you sign up for my 7-day podcast workshop right now, again, it's free. And I'm just starting, like literally in the process of, if you go to how to start a podcast, so yourpodcastcoach.com/how to start a podcast. This is so new. I literally haven't even had a chance to update my website to make all the buttons go to this. Yeah. But if you see what's on the screen right now, just sort of in the middle, that picture on the screen is me in my backyard. But I've got a members site that I'm kind of in the process of building right now. It's got a lot of content in it, but I'm making it free. So you can go in, you can schedule a one-on-one session with me to talk about your podcast idea, which again is a great way to sort of hash out what it is you're trying to do. There's a dozen videos for my startup, which I'm going to be building more videos over the next few weeks. So again, if you click in there right now, you get a bunch of free stuff, and we can develop some conversations about what you're trying to accomplish with your podcast.
Yeah, guys, there's probably about 12 videos in the membership area so far. They're really nice drill down on what we went through the past 40 minutes or so. So I recommend it. And Michael, you're doing it for free. You got enough clients and everything. I think it's a really cool thing you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it feels right now. It feels right to just kind of put this content out there, and if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it. It's all right now. It's free, and this is a nutty time. So let's kind of work on this together.
Cool. Well, thanks, man. Thanks for being on today. DirtyMarketingMastermind.com. I should plug my podcast, DirtyMarketingPodcast.com. If anybody here wants to be a guest on my podcast, would you take guests, Michael?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's actually something that I've just started, because most of mine are just tips, but I got to take my own advice. If I want to grow my podcast, I need to interview people, and that, so on and so forth.
So if you want free exposure basically for your business, and you don't mind talking to one of us, we're down. Just let us know. Thanks, everybody. Cool. All right. See you later, Michael.
All right, man. Take care. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye.